This is the Blazar 50mm Apex, and it's the world's first autofocus anamorphic lens. And I think this thing could be setting a whole new precedent for the world of cinematography. Why? Well, firstly, because it's autofocus. Duh. Up until this point, if you wanted to capture cinematic footage that was fit for the big screen, then you really only had two options. Option one was just to make do with focusing manually, which is something that requires a certain level of skill and patience to master, or you could invest in something like a LiDAR autofocus system, but that requires additional cost and setup time. Well, now you don't need to rely on either of those because we have this lens, and this allows your camera to do most of the work, just like a regular photography lens would. Now, when I heard about this lens, my first reaction was, this is probably going to be expensive. But the good news is, I was totally wrong, because at launch, this lens will set you back $799. Now, I fully appreciate that that price won't be regarded as cheap by everyone, but you do have to consider that in the world of anamorphic lenses, you can often pay that kind of money for a manual-only anamorphic lens. So personally, I didn't think the price was that bad. But some of you might be wondering, what the hell is an anamorphic lens and why should I even care? Well, in very basic terms, an anamorphic lens is a special type of lens that squeezes a wider image onto a standard size sensor by compressing it horizontally. Essentially, it allows you to capture a very wide scene without losing any resolution, making it perfect for creating that high quality cinematic widescreen look. Now, these lenses also create other very distinctive visual effects like oval shaped bokeh balls and horizontal lens flares, all of which are characteristics that are synonymous with feature films. And that's mainly because a lot of Hollywood movies use anamorphic lenses. Now, because this lens will squash the image, the resulting footage will also look pretty distorted straight out of the camera. And in order to correct for this, the footage has to be de-squeezed in post-production later on to restore it to the intended wider aspect ratio. How much the image is squashed by will vary depending on the lens you use. In this case, as you can see written on the side of the lens here, this is a 1.33 times lens, and that makes it a pretty good match for 16:9 sensors. Apparently, Blazar opted for a 1.33 times squeeze ratio in order to enhance autofocus performance, because apparently using a wider ratio can be a little bit too much of a challenge for some mirrorless autofocus systems. They were also very keen to tell me that although this is a 1.33 lens, as I've said multiple times now, the final footage captured will actually look closer to a 1.5 times lens. How they achieved this? Not entirely sure, probably witchcraft.
What do you do with witches?
But either way, we'll find out a little bit later on whether that's actually true or not. In the meantime though, the important thing to note is that all this squashing and squeezing will mean that the preview on the back of your camera will also look slightly weird. And this can make it a little bit tricky at first to not only compose your shots, but also achieve sharp focus. Well, obviously the focusing thing is no longer a problem because this lens will take care of that for you. And luckily, due to the growing popularity of these anamorphic lenses, a lot of modern mirrorless cameras will come with de-squeeze options built into the camera itself, and that means that the footage preview is automatically corrected for you on your video monitor. Now, before I get too carried away, I should also very quickly mention that although Blazar have been kind enough to send me a very early sample copy of this lens for testing, this is not a sponsored video and they haven't paid me to say anything about this lens, so this is an entirely independent review. But also, because this is an early sample copy, I was only able to get my hands on this Sony E-mount version, which I've been using on my Sony A7C Mark II. Now, the only downside to that is that unfortunately this camera doesn't have any of those fancy de-squeeze features built into it, so I was entirely stuck to working with that squashed preview. Blazar are also aiming to make this lens available for Nikon Z mount, Fuji X mount and L mount, and I've even been told that there might be support for Canon RF mount later on down the line. Now personally, I am most excited about this being available for L mount because I think this would be an awesome pairing with the likes of the Panasonic S9 and S5 Mark II, both of which are packed with super handy videography features including custom LUTs, 6K open gate video capture and built-in de-squeeze options. But regardless, how does this thing actually handle? Well, as you can see, this isn't the smallest lens in the world and it's not the lightest either, weighing in at just under 720 grams or 25.4 ounces. But although it does feel a little bit front heavy on this small-ish full-frame camera, I can't say that I found it too uncomfortable to shoot with or overbearing. Now at this point I should mention that although I am shooting on a full frame camera for this test, this lens isn't actually designed for full frame cameras, it's meant for Super 35 or APS-C size cameras. And so in order to avoid getting a weird vignette at the corner of my footage, I did need to stick this camera into crop mode before recording. Now, in terms of overall build, this lens is very, very nicely made. And I've got to say, I do kind of love the all metal design and eye-catching black, silver and orange finish. I mean, at the very least, it makes a nice change to the endless sea of black lenses that I'm usually used to testing. On the lens itself, there's an MF to AF switch, a geared focus ring that has a nice smooth 180-degree rotation, weather sealing around the lens mount, and a declicked aperture ring starting at T1.8 and ending at T16. Rather considerately, the aperture value on the back of your camera actually changes as you adjust this aperture ring as well. Granted, it still notes the value as an f-stop rather than a t-stop, but at least this does allow you to check the current aperture value at a glance rather than having to constantly check the lens barrel. That said, unfortunately, there isn't an A marking on this aperture ring to give you the option to be able to adjust that value using the back of your camera instead, which personally would always be my preference. And because this ring is permanently declicked, I also found that it was quite easy to knock this ring out of position by mistake. So I really did need to be vigilant while shooting to make sure that my settings were correct. But anyway, minor gripes aside, I'm sure at this point you're dying to know, how well does this autofocus actually work? Well, I first decided to put this lens through its paces in the evening just as the sun was setting for two main reasons. Firstly, its wide maximum aperture of T1.8 should make it pretty well equipped for shooting in low light situations. And also, I figured that this would be a much more challenging environment for the AF so that I could really test it out. Luckily, I wasn't disappointed at all. At no point did I feel like I was battling with the AF, and it always appeared to lock on right where I wanted it to. The lens is practically silent in operation too. I mean, not that that really mattered to me because I was out filming in the Canadian wilderness, but for situations where you would need to keep nice and stealthy, this would certainly come in handy. I'm also pleased to say that focus breathing is practically non-existent on this lens, and I honestly cannot tell you how much it pleases me to say that sentence. It feels like most lenses these days breathe heavier than P. Diddy at a house party. What? I heard he had trampolines. At least I think that's what they meant when they heard bouncing coming from upstairs. Anyway, it's also worth noting that the minimum focusing distance on this lens is set to 65 centimeters. And whilst you're not going to be able to capture any super tight close-ups at that distance, I found that it's still plenty close enough for medium detail shots, making this a fairly versatile lens. Okay, so in my opinion, this passes the autofocus test with flying colors, but having fancy AF features isn't much good if the image it creates looks like crap. So what is the image quality like? Well, starting with flaring, when shooting into strong light head on, this will produce a fair amount of ghosting that will wash out your images quite a bit. But whilst normally I would say that this is a characteristic that is probably best avoided, let's not forget that this is an anamorphic lens, and achieving those kind of dramatic, elongated anamorphic flares is a huge part of the appeal for most people. And honestly, if you angle this lens just right, the results it produces are enough to give Christopher Nolan a raging hard-on. Now at this point I should also mention that rather than designing the lens to produce the stereotypical blue flares that you maybe associate with anamorphic lenses, this one creates neutral or silver flares. Essentially, all that really means is that the flaring that this lens creates will adopt the same coloration as the original light source. Now, you might have also spotted that this lens does have some barrel distortion around the edges. Well, Blazar suggested that this was added intentionally at the request of their fans. So, seeing as this was a creative choice rather than being an accidental imperfection, I can't really chastise it all that much in the same way I would other lenses for having that kind of feature. Personally, I certainly think it gives the result some character, but what do you think? Is this something that you would actually want to see from a lens? Either way, one thing I can almost certainly guarantee that wasn't intentional was coloured fringing. And whilst testing for longitudinal chromatic aberration, I did spot some strong blue and red fringing above and below the areas of sharp focus. But other than that, I'm really finding it hard to find reasons to complain about this lens in terms of its performance. The results it captured look plenty sharp enough, even when shooting wide open, and for a lens of this pricing, I was honestly expecting to discover a lot more flaws, so needless to say, overall, I'm pretty impressed. But it doesn't stop right there, because Blazar has also already announced that they'll be releasing a 35mm version of this lens at the start of 2025, and that lens will include the same design and hopefully arguably the same image quality and AF performance as this 50mm option. And to be honest, given that Blazar already has a back catalogue of manual focus anamorphic lenses, I really wouldn't be shocked if more AF versions were soon to follow after that. Now, as I started the video saying, I also think that this type of AF anamorphic lens is going to become the new standard, and I really don't think it's going to be all that long until Blazar find themselves up against some really stiff competition. In fact, hilariously, just before I hit record on this video, I noticed that Sirui has just announced its own fully autofocus 40mm t1.8 1.33 times anamorphic lens coming very soon, so it's kind of already happening. Question is though, will all of these new lenses spark a whole new wave of creative storytelling, or will we just see some fancy lens flares and cat videos? Only time will tell. It's going to be the cat videos, isn't it? See, guys, this is exactly why we can't have nice things.